a special presentation brought to you in...
You can just imagine the great celebration. Not only the year 2000 on the Christian calendar, but the 1000th anniversary of the founding of the nation Vinland the Good. And everywhere, people would have sung the praises of the father of the country, Leif, son of Eric. Instead, he became the man who almost changed the world.
O God of wind and water, O God of night and day, carry our ship safely, smoothly, on a straight course, not astray. Listen to the wind song, see the water play, carry us far away. Listen to the wind song, see the water play, carry us far away.
He is credited with discovering North America, and we don't even know how to say his name. The people of his homeland, Iceland, call him Leifr. Scandinavians call him Leif. American school children learn his name as Leif Eriksson, and they learn that he was a Viking. And Vikings? Fierce warriors, cunning raiders, but also daring sailors, farmers, politicians, businessmen, and storytellers.
Once he had made ready, Leif set sail. After being tossed about at sea for a long time, he chanced upon land where he had not expected any to be found. Fields of self-sown wheat and vines were growing there.
Leif Eriksson and his travels took place early in the year 1000 and followed 200 years of exploration and expansion into the North Atlantic. And when he set foot on the land he called Vinland, mankind was taking its first steps toward globalization. Humanity had come full circle.
The Vikings expanding west, reaching Greenland and North America, the native peoples who had expanded out of Siberia, working their way through North America, came together, not for a very long period of time, but over 500 years they met and had interactions, traded, and so forth. They came to know each other, what to expect from each other. And so in a sense, it really is closing the ring of humanity around the world for the first time. It is the first true global experience that humanity's ever faced.
The Vikings were Northmen, the Norse. Originally from Scandinavia, they didn't call themselves Vikings. Instead, they were Goths, or Norwegians, or Danes. Viking was a European term used to describe those who traveled and traded and raided by sea. The Viking era began in 793, when seaborne raiders attacked Lindisfarne Monastery off the coast of England. It was a stunning and brutal attack on defenseless monks. Throughout Christian Europe, people began to talk of the curse of the North, to preach that Vikings were agents of the devil. As their legend grew, the Vikings could change tactics. Instead of raiding, they began to demand tribute. Better relations led to trade. Eventually, they began to settle. In the 9th century, they founded and governed the Irish city of Dublin. York in England was conquered by a double-jointed Viking named Ivar the Boneless. Normandy in France was named after the Norseman when it fell to a Viking named Hrolf. His great-great-great-grandson was William the Conqueror. Tradition says the nation of Russia was named after a Slavic word for Viking. Moving from Scandinavia along the rivers to the east and south, Vikings established trading centers that would later become the cities of St. Petersburg and Kiev. Viking mercenaries served the Emperor of Constantinople, fighting throughout the Mediterranean and the Holy Lands.
In the process of these travels, they were meeting, trading with, fighting with, discussing, learning languages, having children. So in a sense, this enrichment of our history by the Viking experience really is a kind of a network, a kind of internet of information.
Those that didn't go a Viking lived mostly as farmers. The farms were small and close together, a few thousand square feet to grow crops, surrounded with pasture land held in common. There were no cash crops. Instead, they grazed horses, cows, goats, and sheep. Before the Viking Age, political life centered on the family, the clan, and the chief. That changed rapidly. Trading centers became centers of wealth and power. Trade created kings. Kings used that power to create nations. The independent Viking clans were forced to submit or leave. Many left.
Next week, uncover clues explaining the disappearance of the Vikings. Then, the Terracotta Army and the war. Ancient History Tuesdays on History Television.
The Viking migration started here, along the west coast of Norway. Near the medieval castle that dominates the old city of Bergen, you can still see the ruins of a once thriving Viking stronghold. From this and other harbors, they sailed to Ireland and Great Britain, to the Shetland and the Faroe Islands. In the 870s, the Vikings followed Irish monks to the island of Iceland.
And this was just what they wanted, a low-lying land. The life when the settlers came here was good. The one thing that Iceland had to export was wool. Life turned on livestock raising and the production of dairy products.
The settlers saw themselves as refugees from the growing tyranny of the Scandinavian kings. And in the year 930, they formed a democratic state led by a high court called the Althing. Each year, 36 chieftains of equal standing gathered for 2 weeks in this rocky gorge, a place called Thingvellir.
There was no police force, there was no group of people who could coerce farmers into following the laws. This was all done in a private way in which negotiations were made between leaders and followers, and it tended to keep the society in harmony. It wasn't a peaceful society, but it wasn't a warlike society either.
Today, the Icelandic flag stands near to what we think was the Law Rock. The chiefs and free citizens watched from surrounding crags as the law speaker rose and recited aloud the rules that governed the country. He had to commit the entire legal code to memory because the Vikings had an oral culture.
The laws in medieval Iceland, as most medieval laws, were very different from what we know as law today. If one steals a horse and rides past one farm, it is supposedly so much of a fine. If you go back 2 farms, it's more.
Actually, you could trace the discovery of North America back to the laws passed by the Althing. The story begins with Leif's father, Eric the Red, a fiery leader whose quick temper and a bad habit of killing people who crossed him got him banished from Iceland.
One way to get rid of troublemakers is to outlaw them. There were 2 kinds of outlawry. One was the most serious, in which an outlaw then could be killed with impunity. This was called full outlawry. Full outlawry. But Eric was given lesser outlawry. That's 3 years in which he had to leave the country, in which tempers then would cool off, and then he could return.
We know what those laws were like because they were finally written down after the coming of Christianity. The Book of Laws is a unique and comprehensive record of an ancient legal system. It is one of the crown jewels of the Icelandic language. 2 others, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, tell us what we know about the migration to Greenland, the discovery, and attempts to settle in North America.
Erik sailed seaward from Snæfellsnes and approached land under the glacier called Hvítserkur. From there he sailed southward, seeking suitable land for settlement.
The sagas form part of a great collection of poems and stories from the Viking Age. Like the laws, the sagas were first passed down orally. They were carefully detailed stories of ordinary people at the end of the first millennium. The sagas tell of people working and playing, and sometimes fighting, in quiet, self-reliant farming communities. But even when people are killing each other, the Viking world springs to life in the calm, clear prose of the storytellers.
The good thing about the sagas is that they are fun to read. They are entertaining just as literature. They supply you with humor, they supply you with descriptions of real characters and real dilemmas that are not always solved according to the formula of heroic literature.
And they are good stories full of action and adventure. There are plot twists, flawed heroes, and well-meaning villains.
The sagas are astonishingly modern when to a reader of this day and age. They read like modern literature. It's not only the plot, the themes, the characterization, the ordinary people.
The Icelandic sagas are more familiar to Americans than they know. Think of the Western movie hero living on the frontier, forced to take the law into his own hands. That was a recurring plotline 1,000 years ago.
Oscar Wilde said once that the Norse Vikings had discovered America, but had the good sense to lose it again.
The sagas were finally written down, copied and recopied in the 13th and 14th centuries. Some of those early manuscripts are now in the care of the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. They're available, if you have the right credentials and an appointment. Gisli Sigurdsson is one of the few keepers of the keys, allowed to open the vault and handle the ancient documents.
They select what they want to tell us about. They are written for a particular purpose. In a most general sense, they tell us the truth about the general time when Iceland was settled.
But which truth? The truth as seen by Eric the Red and his extended family, or the truth as seen by Christian transcribers a few hundred years later?
We can confirm the general outline with the archaeology, but also we have two different versions of these texts. We have the Flateyjarbók version, Saga of the Greenlanders, which we have here, and then we have also the Saga of Eric the Red, which tells of the same or similar events, but in a different fashion. But certainly an accurate description can be extracted from the saga texts if you combine the Saga of the Greenlanders with the Saga of Eric the Red.
Compared with most European languages, Icelandic hasn't changed much over the centuries. Icelandic speakers today can read the old manuscripts.
Sigldu burt og gaf Leifur nafn landinu eftir landkostum og kallaði Vínland. In the end they leave the land, going back for Greenland, calling the land Vínland.
The two sagas tell us Eric lived on the west coast of Iceland. Archaeologists followed the saga's clues and oral tradition and located what they believe is the farm of Eric the Red. They searched this valley, and they found ruins they think were his home.
We have a very long oral history that tells us that this is Eiríksstaðir, the farm of Eric the Red. It's a Viking Age hall dating from the last part of the 10th century.
The Icelandic government decided to rebuild the house just down the hill. The material is sod, just like in Eric's time.
We have the site here, we have the foundations. It gives us the size and the outlook of it. Buildings like this, torfhouses, there's a continuous tradition here in Iceland for that. People were building those houses until this century. So it's not a forgotten art. We know people who have lived in those houses, and we have people who still can make those houses.
In addition to his building techniques, Erik's story is still very much alive in this valley. The present-day owner of the farm across the way refused to let workers take sod or stone from his land for the reconstruction. It seems a mere 1,000 years ago, Erik murdered the man who had owned that farm. Using the victim's sod wouldn't be right, said the farmer. Wood is hard to come by in Iceland, so Erik probably roofed his house with timbers he brought with him from Norway. And under that roof was born Leif Eriksson, Erik's son, according to the sagas. But neither Leif nor his father stayed long. After a battle over a bed headboard and the murder of a couple of neighbors, Erik was banished. He set sail for the west and a mysterious land that had been reported just over the horizon. He found it and explored it for the 3 years of his exile. Then he returned to Iceland, gathered family and friends, and sailed back to build a permanent colony.
In the summer, Erik left to settle the country he had found, which he called Greenland, as he said people would be attracted to go there if it had a favorable name.
Erik had a good plan. He talked of a green, rich land. He talked of the resources that were there, of seals and whales that knew nothing of humans and were easy to hunt, and people went to Greenland. What they found in Greenland was truly the edge of the world.
It was not an easy crossing, according to the sagas. More than 25 ships set out, only 14 reached land. Archaeologists estimate about 500 settlers made it. The Greenland they found was different from Greenland today. Samples drilled from the ice cap say it was warmer here 1,000 years ago. Just a few degrees, but enough to allow the Vikings to build their farms, graze their herds, and hunt. The main settlement was in Brattahlid, along the fjords of southwest Greenland. Erik the Red built his new home here. Again, a reconstruction sits near the site. It was not a self-sufficient settlement. Survival depended on trade. Wood and iron and cloth came from Norway via Iceland. In return, the Greenlanders shipped falcons, eiderdown, walrus skins, and tusks. The ruins of more than 100 farms have been unearthed in the surrounding hills. As the first millennium ended, there were probably more than 1,000 people living here.
Erik the Red farmed at Brattahlid. There he was held in the highest esteem, and everyone deferred to his authority. Heathen were the people of Greenland at that time.
The Vikings didn't go to church, but they had a religion with gods and giants and spirits and an afterlife. Odin was the leader, ruler of Asgard. That's where all the gods lived. Viking warriors who died bravely in battle were welcomed to his great hall, Valhalla. There they could fight all day, their wounds always healed, and spend the nights feasting and carousing. The Viking gods were not immortal, nor were they all-powerful. They fought battles, played tricks. Odin was the wisest of the gods. He had traded an eye for knowledge, but he wasn't always the most powerful.
The principal gods, it seems, according to the law books, are three. This is Njörður, the Lord of the Sea. He is also the god of the merchants and all sailors. His son Freyr, who is the god of agriculture and fertility. And then the third one, diplomatically called the Almighty One. This could be Thor, and I think it was probably Thor, the protector of humanity. Some people think it's Odin, and so you see we are still arguing about this.
There were no temples. Vikings could ask the gods for help, but they didn't really pray to them. In Iceland, the old gods have not been forgotten. In the city of Reykjavik, there is Odin's Street, Thor's Street, and Freya's Street. Paganism has been reestablished as a religion. Icelanders can choose to have money deducted from their taxes to support it. In just a day, the old gods were swept away. King Olaf down in Norway banned trading with pagans. The Vikings in Iceland, who depended on trade for the necessities of life, had to make a choice. According to the sagas, they met at Thingfiller. Half voted to stay pagan, the others were ready to convert to Christianity. So they left it to the law speaker to decide. He considered it for a day and a half, then ruled that Iceland would become Christian, and that was that. The old customs were not entirely swept away. Pagan rituals continued, and some of the Viking chiefs decided that if they must be Christian, they would make themselves bishops.
The conversion to Christianity was in reality, to use modern terms, a merger between Ásatrú on one hand and some form of Christianity on the other. To add a new god would have not have been a big deal.
The king spoke to Leif privately and asked, "Do you intend to sail to Greenland this summer?" Leif answered, "I would like to do so if it is your wish." The king answered, "You shall go as my envoy and convert Greenland to Christianity."
The sagas say that when Leif brought the word to Greenland, Eric the Red's wife was quick to convert, but Eric himself was reluctant to give up the old faith. His wife refused to sleep with him until he agreed to build her a church. He built her a church. Archaeologists have unearthed the foundation, and the pattern was used to build this structure, a replica of the first church in North America. Christianity eventually became so firmly established that Rome sent a bishop to Greenland. The ruins of his church are in Gardar, near the present-day community of Igaliko. And the churches evolved. The ruins of the Valsa Church give testimony to the settlement's dedication to the Christian faith. These rocks were trimmed and placed by hand nearly a millennium ago.
You are watching Ancient History Tuesdays on History Television. It may look like smooth sailing,
since grapes don't grow north of the province of New Brunswick. Others believe the clerics who wrote down the sagas were confused by the Norse word vin, which means grass or fields. Those experts say Vinland could be any meadowland. It was even possible that Leif was taking his father's tack by giving the new country an appealing name. And many treat the entire episode as a myth.
I think we do have a problem knowing a lot of the details of the sagas and so forth, but in terms of who the major characters were, I think most scholars believe that Leif was a real person. Eric the Red, certainly a real person. There are very real events that surround their histories, described in the sagas. So I think this question of whether Leif exists or not is sort of gone by the board.
The sagas tell of settlements started and abandoned, of the first Viking child born in the new land, of ships lost in fog only to discover other new lands, the first contact between Indians and Europeans, the first battle, the first death. But for 1,000 years, there was no physical evidence that the story of Leif Eriksson was true. Then in the 1960s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad started a search for evidence of Viking settlements in North America. He considered Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Nova Scotia, but came to the conclusion that Leif Eriksson's camp was most likely in Newfoundland. After months of searching, he came to Lansa Meadows, a small fishing village at the northern tip of the province. There, in one of the most celebrated moments of Viking archaeology, he asked a fisherman named George Decker if there were any old ruins nearby. The fisherman said, "Yep," and the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America was found. Among the ruins, archaeologists found a Celtic Viking ring pin, a spindle, and 3 butternut shells, husks from trees that grow much farther south.
They were found in different places on the site, but all in context with the Norse material. So obviously people had brought these nuts here. And these people must have been the Norse. And that tells us that the Norse who were here would have gone at least as far south as eastern New Brunswick, to the area where there is wild grapes. So the name Vinland was really based on fact. And it's the first time that has been proven, really.
Researchers unearthed 8 buildings of Viking design at Lansa Meadows, 3 houses and 5 outbuildings. They've been able to piece together a vision of what life was like. Here as many as 100 people could have stayed at one time. There were some women, no children. They may have passed the time playing an old Viking game called Nevataf. It's a distant cousin of chess. One player gets a king and 12 pawns. The other player has 24 pawns. The object is to get the king from the center of the board to one of the corners. The settlement was not a farm. There are no ruins of barns nor evidence of grazing. But there is evidence of weaving and ironwork.
They built a little oven, a little smelting oven of the same kind as you find in Norway and Iceland. It was a very small production, just a one-shot firing, so it wasn't a major iron production site. But for one thing, only Europeans on this continent made iron, and it's the first time that iron was made in North America.
Charcoal from the forge has been carbon dated to around the year 1000. And then there are these bits of rusted rivets. They were not made in the New World. More reason to believe that Europeans were here 500 years before Columbus. The discovery of the site at Lansa Meadows has not ended the debate over the location of Vinland. Viking artifacts have been found at a dozen or more sites throughout eastern Canada. A Norse penny has been found as far south as Maine. The findings fit a pattern if you think of Lansa Meadows as a jumping-off place, a base for exploration, trade, or hunting parties.
They were not temporary dwellings. They were meant as a winter base where you could go exploring during the summer and then return late in the fall and spend the winter here where you were safe and then continue to Greenland the next summer. One reason they needed a base like this was that the sailing season, even in the slightly warmer 11th century, was quite short when you had to start out in Greenland. So if they had to go and come back to Greenland in one summer, they wouldn't have time to go much farther than that.
Vinland, then, is probably a lot of places, everywhere the Vikings explored. That hasn't stopped thousands of amateur and professional archaeologists from searching for another settlement. What they're looking for is more than a few stones or the odd artifact. they're looking for trash. Wherever human beings have gone, they leave stuff behind. Find a settlement, and you will find discarded bits of wood and metal and animal bones. There are lots of theories placing Leif's lost Vinland in Maine, or New York, or Maryland, or the Carolinas. Some Brazilians think he reached the Amazon. So far, Lanza Meadows is the only Viking settlement found. Still, they were great sailors 1,000 years ago.
If you can manage the rough seas in the Mediterranean and in the coastal areas outside Gibraltar, is nothing to sail down the American coast. But I think that they realized that going further south, they would gain nothing.
And then there are the runes. Vikings developed an alphabet after seeing Roman inscriptions. Runes carved in stones have been found in North America. The most famous is the Kensington Rune Stone found in Minnesota. Specialists say it is a prank turned fraud. The debate has been as passionate as it is political.
You are watching Ancient History Tuesdays on History Television. It may look History Television.
The search of the old Viking sites has proven that the Vikings were wonderful craftsmen, a characteristic few would credit to the image of the Viking warrior. They worked in gold and silver, bone and stone, and wood. Like the Egyptians, Vikings were buried with the necessities for the next life. For the very wealthy Vikings, that included entire ships. The Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, Norway, holds 3 of the most famous finds: the Oseberg, the Tuna, and the Gokstad, named for the places where they were found. They are beautiful ships. Hand-carved slats of oak and pine were nailed one on top of the other without an internal frame. Shipbuilders call them clinker-built ships. Today's automotive industry calls the technique unibody construction. It made the ships very flexible, able to bend and ride with the waves. Crossbeams were added only later for additional strength and to support the masts.
They were good enough to carry your whole family, your cattle, everything you own to Iceland for colonizing. They were good enough to handle the North Atlantic, going to Greenland and even North America in the late Viking Age.
There were 2 basic designs for Viking ships: the familiar longboat with its open deck and a large crew pulling on oars, and the Kanar, an ocean-going trading vessel. Both had sails, usually made of wool. There are more than 24 replicas afloat today. Some have been sailed across the Atlantic. One Kanar has sailed around the world. For modern-day sailors, mastering a Viking ship is a difficult task. Just ask Thor Heyerdahl, who spent his life reinventing ancient sailing techniques.
To handle a Viking ship, you must have experience. You must be a good sailor. I would never be able to do it myself. And we think that the boats I've been using are more primitive than the Viking ships. The boats of reeds, like the ancient Egyptians, or boats of logs, like the Inca. But they may look more primitive, but they are far safer. And in the beginning of navigation, security at sea was more important than speed and carrying capacity. So when you're in the kind of boat that I've been handling, let the waves come on board. They run through the bottom and out again. The vessel floats in itself. But the Viking ship, if a sea breaks in, you have to bail for your life, not to sink.
Some Viking seamanship is still with us. Their name for rudder was skiri. The side of the ship where the rudder was fastened was the styrboard. That's where we get the term starboard. There is much speculation about a Viking compass or other navigational tool. If they existed, none has ever been found. The Vikings relied on observation, keeping track of time, of distance, of landmarks, of tides and birds.
There is a description of how you sail from Norway to Greenland, which is also navigation by landmarks across the North Atlantic. You sail to a place called Hernar, north of Bergen. You sail due west. You should see the Shetland Islands in good weather. You should see the Faroe Islands halfway below the horizon. You should not see Iceland, but you should have contact with seagulls coming out, and then you'll hit the southern part of Greenland. As easy as that.
And it worked. If you didn't get lost in the fog or tossed off course by storms, the sailing time from Norway to Greenland could be as short as 14 days.
Leif made land in Eiríksfjord and went home to the farm at Brattahlíð. There he was received warmly.
After Leif's voyage, the sagas say there were other attempts to settle. Leif's brothers Thorvald and Thorstein and his half-sister Freydis all traveled to Vinland. Thorvald was killed in battle with Native Americans and buried in the New World. The final visit to Vinland was led by a couple named Thorfinn and Gudridur. Their expedition included 5 women and 80 men. They stayed for 3 years, then returned home with a rich cargo of timber and fur. They had a child in the New World, a son they named Snorri, the first child of European descent born in North America. Gudridur later became a nun, traveled back to Iceland, and even made a pilgrimage to Rome. She probably saw more of the world than any other person of her time. She earned the nickname of Gudridur the Well-Traveled.
In the Viking Age, when the men were out going a Viking or away on trading voyages, the woman came to have a more important role as running the farm, for instance. They had certain rights that made them outstanding. They could ask for a divorce and so forth, but by the same token, a woman didn't inherit as much as a man, and she could be married away against her will.
It so happened one day that Freydis Eiríksdóttir made a journey from her home to visit the brothers Helgi and Finnbogi. She asked them if they would join her with her ship on an expedition to Vinland and have a half share in profits from it.
No one then thought it strange that women could lead expeditions, and it seems participate in villainy. Leif's half-sister had her partners killed and stole their boat.
Next week, Uncover Clue Television, an Alliance Atlantis network.
The Viking Age ended in Europe in 1066 with the defeat of King Harold of England by William the Conqueror, a Viking king from Normandy. The Vikings had finally become part of the establishment. In the New World, it was a more gradual change. Beyond his Vinland voyage, the sagas don't say anything more about Leif Eriksson, and there is no mention of further attempts to settle in Vinland.
People have wondered why, having discovered this wonderful Vinland, why didn't they come and settle for good? But you have to see it in the context of a time. This is a new fledgling colony in Greenland. But to sail here is almost as far as going back to Europe. It's just like today we can go to the moon, but the time hasn't quite come to settle in space.
The Vikings stayed in Greenland several hundred years, and then they just vanished. A bishop sent to re-establish contact found ruins and empty farms.
The disappearance of the Greenland Norse has always been a big mystery because it's such a well-known colony, so many churches on the landscape and so on. There are many different theories. There are theories of disease, theories of pirates, economic theories that the people basically just wound out.
There are some signs that they used up their resources. The Arctic ecology could only sustain so many people, so many animals.
People in the north are living on a pretty fine edge. When the Norse arrived, they brought not only themselves and their needs for fuel, firewood, house-building materials, but they brought their animals. And the animals played havoc with an ecosystem where they had never been before.
The damage to the environment was compounded by a drop in temperature in the 14th century, an event called by researchers the Little Ice Age. Greenland Eskimos moved south into the hunting grounds and pastures of the Vikings. Where there was conflict, the sides were evenly matched.
Militarily, the only big advantage that the Vikings had is that they were in these big ships that were good fortresses, you know, for them. But they all had to come ashore, they all had to find food, they had to find water, and when they did this, they were vulnerable.
The Vikings called the Native Americans Skraelings. They didn't always fight. Archaeologists working at old campsites have found there was contact and trade. Both continued until the 14th century.
The hard evidence proves that Leif Eriksson, the first European to explore and settle in America, almost half a millennium ahead of Columbus. That's an achievement.
It's kind of a special thing that we have such a historical account of what happened, of this long trend of Viking history, of the expansion of a people out of a homeland.
The biggest misconception has been thinking that the Vikings had nothing to do with modern history, thinking the Vikings are something very far away and very foreign, that they didn't have an impact on American culture.
And on both sides of the Atlantic, the Viking legacy reaches deep into our cultures. Their art has inspired craftsmen for a millennium. Maybe a third of the English language is descended from the tongue the Vikings spoke. Just look at the calendar. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday were named for Odin, Thor, and Freya, gods Eric the Red worshipped. And the achievements of Leif, son of Eric, called Leif the Lucky, have come to symbolize humanity's bravery, curiosity, and skill, as well as the spirit of the Icelandic people. In Greenland today, the ruins of the old Valsa church stand alone on the side of a hill. The church records say there was a wedding here in 1408. Thorstein Olafsson married Sigrid Bjornsdotter. And the rest is silence. For all the Vikings' bravery and determination, 4 centuries of life in Greenland came to an end. The once busy passage between the old world and the new disappeared like the wake behind a boat.
See the water play, carry us far away. Listen to the wind song, see the water play, carry us far away. Oh God of thunder and lightning, spare us your wrath, please guide us on as we sail into the unknown, in the wake of the setting sun. Listen to the wind song, see the water play, carry us far away. Listen to the wind song.